Hey everybody, Aaron Bishop here with the Patterns of Life Bible. In the book of Acts, we are introduced to a character whose name becomes synonymous with the New Testament in many cases. This is none other than Paul the Apostle. Well, the book of Acts doesn't start with Paul the Apostle. He appears early on, but he's really not there for the first 8 chapters or so. It's not until chapter 9 that we read of the event that changes Paul's life and the trajectory of his life from that point forward. This story is the story of a life that has changed, a life that's in transition through a sudden moment, through just an instant of revelation. So often, change can come that quickly, and this story tells the story of how that happened with Paul. Let's take a look at this text in the book of Acts and see what we can discover from it. In the Patterns of Life Bible, this is Acts pericope 17. In a normal Bible, it is Acts chapters 9, verses 1 through 22. And as we see, this is not a chiasm as we usually find in the Bible. Chiasm is the most common, but this particular story is a parallel. And this parallelism is set up in such a way that it tells the story of one man who is one way, and then the story is retold again of the same man who is now a different way. It's kind of like the line in The Chosen from Mary Magdalene, where I was one way, but now I'm another, and the thing in between was him. Well, that's the sort of story that's going on here in the book of Acts with Paul. And it begins with being sent bound before the high priest. Now, A and A prime, they do actually act as bookends at the very beginning and the very end of this pattern. And in both cases, it's talking about Paul being the one who sends the people bound back to the high priest to be tried before the Sanhedrin and presumably killed just as Stephen was killed when he was tried before the Sanhedrin. So the 4 pericopes that we find between A and A prime in parallel then tell the story of Paul before and after his conversion. So in B and B prime, we hear of God calling by name. In B, it's Paul on the way to Damascus. Jesus appears to him from a light from heaven, and Paul falls down on his face as God calls him out by name. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Now, in B prime, it's someone else who's being called out by name. It's not Saul, it's Ananias, this disciple who lived in Damascus. And Ananias is called out by God in a vision and told to welcome Saul, this man who'd been persecuting Christians and binding them and sending them to Jerusalem to stand before the high priest and the Sanhedrin. Yeah, that guy. God tells Ananias to welcome Saul into his home, which for someone who's in that position is, frankly, that's a big task. That's a big ask from God. And yet Ananias does so faithfully. In C and C prime, we see the response of both Saul and Ananias to God. In C, Saul responds, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, "I am Jesus, who you persecuted." And they have a short conversation. In C prime, Ananias answers and says, I've heard of this man, Saul. Are you sure this is the guy you want me to go welcome into my home? And there's a short conversation between Ananias and God as well in C prime. In D, we read of Saul having his sight taken from him. This is, in many ways, it's a physical embodiment of Saul's own spiritual blindness that he's experiencing at this point in his life. He can't see Jesus for who he is. He can't experience him. And because he can't see Jesus as the Messiah, he's doing this persecution. But in D prime, when the scales fall off of his eyes, he is able to see clearly. And from that point on, he can see clearly who Jesus is. He can see clearly how he fits into the story of the Bible and how he fulfills the prophecies of the Old Testament. And then in E, we read that Saul fasted. After this happened, he was in the vision, he lost his sight. He didn't eat or drink for 3 days. 3-day fast is actually a very powerful thing. I've done it several times in my life, and God always seems to answer when I've gone through a 3-day fast. Saul as well, going through a 3-day fast, nothing to eat, nothing to drink for 3 days. That's a very serious fast, and God answers him. And then in E prime, after the scales fall away, after he's been healed, after his sight has been returned, finally he sits down to eat and to drink. And that's where the story finishes, because Saul then goes out into the city, begins to proclaim Jesus as the Messiah, and the people look at him and says, "But isn't this Saul? Isn't this the man who was persecuting us just so recently?" This story is one of the more foundational narratives in the New Testament, because it's one of the few narratives we get that's not of Jesus and that's not of one of his original 12 disciples. We do read of Paul throughout the rest of the book of Acts, along with Luke and several other people that appear throughout the story. But this story of conversion, it highlights just how quickly God can change a life. It can take just a moment for God to reveal himself to a person and for someone who was one way to change instantly and become another way. The God of the Bible is a God of power, and that power was exhibited in the life of Paul, and through that was able to be spread to so many other people. And Christianity was founded in one aspect because of what happened here. Without Paul, this message to the Gentiles would have taken longer. But as we read throughout the book of Acts, Paul wasn't the only one spreading the news to Gentiles. He encounters several places people who have heard the word of Jesus, have accepted him as Lord. The gospel was spreading without Paul, but Paul becomes the man who writes the vast majority of the rest of the New Testament after these stories. And it's in this story, the story of a life change, that we read of and discover how he went from being a person of persecuting the church to being a person persecuted by those he once served.